One of the most common questions I get from new media producers, especially podcasters, is, do I really need to get a release from every person I interview on my show? Hi, I'm entertainment and media attorney Gordon Firemark, and this Asked and Answered series is where I give answers to common legal questions so you can take your career and business to the next level. Stick around and I'll explain, and if you stay till the end of the video, I'm going to provide you access to a great free resource you can use to deal with just this situation. So do you really need to get a release from everybody you interview? Well, the short answer is yes. Okay, that's my advice, actually. I know I have colleagues who are going to tell me that I'm wrong, so let me just address those things first. Strictly speaking, it may not be necessary to have a release from your interview subjects. They showed up for the interview, they likely knew they were being recorded, taped, filmed, or whatever, and it's a good bet that they knew you plan to distribute the interview to the public. So it is possible to argue that they've given implied consent. And that's a valid argument, to a degree. But the problem comes up when the interview subject later on decides to challenge the scope of that consent. Earlier today, I had a situation in which an interview subject, after the interview, insisted on being given a chance to review it and to direct the editing of the piece. Now, since there was no formal release agreement, we'll never know the answer to whether this kind of right of approval and editing was something that was promised. Of course, the podcaster says that it wasn't, and that's why we were having the conversation. Now, if there had been a release, it would be much clearer. A release is a contract, and it defines the nature of the relationship between the parties and the scope of their respective rights. It provides valuable evidence of the parties' intent if there's ever an argument or dispute later. But just as importantly, it serves to prevent those disputes in the first place, because it lays out the framework of things before the recording ever happens. When you get a release, you actually get several valuable things. The interviewer's agreement to show up and actually give the interview in the first place, consent to be recorded, your right to edit the performance as you see fit, and the consent to the kinds of uses you have planned for the material. And finally, you're getting a promise not to sue you. So here's the scenario. Suppose that years after your interview is done and it's published, it's out there, and you get this idea. You want to package up a DVD or a CD of your greatest interviews and sell it as a product. Or maybe you're going to adapt the interviews into a book and you're going to sell or use to promote your other products and services. Well, if you don't have a release, you could have some trouble. You're taking this recording that was made for one purpose and you're reusing it for some other, maybe more commercial purpose. That interview person, that interviewee, might be justified in expecting to be compensated for that subsequent use. But if you have a release and it defines the scope of the rights properly, you'll be free to do those things without getting any further permission or having to pay any compensation. Now, a release doesn't have to be a big, formal 5-page contract. Most releases are 2 or 3 short paragraphs. They explain the intentions of the parties, and then it gets signed by the interviewee. Now, some podcasters actually just record the consent before the interview starts. Heck, I do that in my own podcast. And that certainly is a manifestation of the consent that's needed. But there's a risk. You've got to get it just right and articulate the scope of the rights fully. And that can be hard to do quickly. And for the interviewee, if he or she is even the slightest bit nervous, it's going to go by so fast they won't even know what they're consenting to. So I always recommend using a written release or maybe an online release where they, check a box and they digitally indicate that they've read it and they agree to the terms. Now, at the beginning of the video, I promised you a free resource, and here it is. If you click through to firemark.com/podcastlaw and sign up with your name and email, I will send you a model podcast guest release template that you can modify for your own use. Here's that URL again, firemark.com/podcastlaw.